It's a great pleasure to introduce Mariana Mazzucato, who will be the lunch speaker. Mariana, if there is any consolation, I'm not having lunch either, like you, right now. But so Mariana has, of course, a very long CV, and she doesn't need an introduction, but I would just say a few words. She's a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at UCL, where she founded the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She has won many international prizes, including Italy's highest civilian honor, which is the Grande Ufficiale di Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana, the Leontief Prize in 2018, and she was recently appointed by Pope Francis to the Pontifical Academy for Life. She has written many very well-known books. And there is one skill that I find very rare, it's scarce among academics that I have noticed in Mariana also as a former policymaker, which is that she truly knows how to engage with policymakers and motivate them. I think it has to do with two things. Of course, one is that what for decades she has been studying about how to organize institutions and how to organize states for promoting innovation, for promoting learning in an economy. But also, I do feel that many bureaucrats do have a sense of an innovative sense. They will want to be innovative. And that kind of dialogue does motivate government officials and policymakers in general. And also she, at the UCL, she has built a community. I've seen that the times I was there. People feel identified, and that's key. The leadership role is also key for making ideas transcend and having their own life. So Mariana is among the small community that for years kept working on issues that were not receiving that much attention in the mainstream literature and in the mainstream discussion, that, as we saw yesterday and today, are now at the very center of the public policy debate. So like Joe and Daniel Roderick and Eric has the advantage of having studied these issues for decades. So Mariana, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We're sorry that you can't be in person, but we're glad that we can have this discussion. Of course, you will miss the very nice view here of Central Park and foliage. But we will have a 20 minutes initial presentation, and then we will have about 40 minutes for Q&A. So thank you very much, Mariana, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Should we just do a quick sound check? Everything's good? You can hear me? Yes? Martin, can you just say, oops?
Yeah, we can hear you very well, Mariana. It's all good.
Fantastic, fantastic. Good. So first of all, thank you so much, not only for inviting me, but also for your patience. What happened is I was going from country to country, and after the fourth country, I was supposed to go from Cali in Colombia, where you might know we just had the COP16 on biodiversity, to New York City for 24 hours, and then to fly down to Barbados, where we're actually working on a blue/green industrial strategy with the Prime Minister here. And my body had a bit of a collapse, so I begged, please, can I do it virtually so I can cut off at least 2 of the flights. So thank you so much. Apologies, and I'm very jealous, not so much for the Central Park view, because I won't describe my view here, or I might make you jealous, but especially for your company, your conversations, because I do think this is incredibly important. I will stop sharing when I'm done with the 20 minutes, just so we can then see each other live, of course, for the panel. And what I want to argue is that industrial strategy is actually growth strategy. It's economic strategy, especially for countries that have low investment. Many countries have high profits, but low investments. Those profits are not getting reinvested back into the economy. That's a huge problem. It also raises inequality, but it also financializes the economy. But we also have problematic government policies, which I think have been designed problematically in terms of, at best, fixing market failures. At worst, get out of the way. But if it's at best, even when the public good itself is framed as correcting for the lack of investment by the private sector, when we don't have clear objectives that need kind of common good principles designed into all the contracts, not de-risking, but sharing risks, sharing rewards, then I think we're in trouble. And I think a new industrial strategy based on market shaping and not market fixing, for me, is kind of like the key new economic principle. And what I want to do in the limited time I have is to share some thinking that we've had in the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Thank you, Martin, for talking about it briefly. We, I think, circulated a report. It's in one of the links on the website for your conference, just the experience we've had with what does it actually mean in concrete terms to put industrial strategy, first of all, at the center of an economy, not somewhere peripheral in the Ministry for Innovation, and then, you know, the financial policies, the economic policies stay how they were before. So at the center, but also really what does it mean to put this kind of new way of thinking of industrial strategy that I'll talk about in terms of designing policies in a way that truly foster public and private investment. Of course, you know, what drives growth is investment in both the public and private sectors, but how do we actually do it in an outcomes-oriented way with contracts themselves requiring that investment instead of just subsidies, guarantees, handouts for staying in place? What does this mean for the tools? All those different tools with Danny, which Joe and others, you know, write about. We all write about these different tools, whether it's development banks or something else. What does it mean to really put them also at the center of a strategy? And I'll talk about some recent experience around public sector procurement, which is a huge proportion of government budgets, whether it's Barbados, tiny country, it's about 35% of the government's budget, or the US as well. You know, any large, medium, or small country has a procurement budget. What does it mean to really catalyze it at the center of an industrial strategy that has goals at the center of that? What does it mean for a social contract, a new way for public and private actors to work together, not in parasitic ways with just, again, guarantees and subsidies, but actually to have some metrics for additionality, but symbiosis, mutualism, you know, these things that biologists talk about when they look at ecosystems. I think we in our world have become a bit lazy when we talk about partnerships and ecosystems. My world is the economics of innovation. We often talk about innovation ecosystems, but we don't really have good metrics to differentiate a parasitic from a symbiotic ecosystem. And what might a new industrial strategy approach tell us about that? I'm not going to talk about co-creation and participation, but it has become a bit of an obsession of mine because I think the reason we have so much populism around the world, it's not because people are stupid. It's because we've failed. We've failed. Our policies have not delivered in terms of better, not just wages in many countries, but literally well-being. If we have policies around, say, a greener economy that don't affect how people feel, how they feel valued, dignity, and self-worth, then it doesn't work. And actually, it was very interesting to talk to the White House team about their own experience, even in states where the IRA and so on have had an effect economically. If people don't feel part of it, then we're in trouble. My own experience with this whole issue of co-creation and participation is from someone who learns about it. I have nothing to teach about it, and I've learned a lot about it from cities and even neighborhoods, my own neighborhood in London, where they've put this idea of outcomes-oriented industrial strategy and green growth at the center of how the community engages with the policymakers through resident associations, citizen assemblies, and so on. So I actually won't say much more about that. Perhaps we can come to it in the discussion. Sorry, my timer just went off and I have to make sure I don't talk over. And then hugely important, and I will talk about it, the dynamic capabilities within our public institutions. I've been writing about this since I wrote The Entrepreneurial State back in 2013. When we don't have dynamic capabilities within public institutions, when we outsource that capacity, whether it's to McKinsey or to Serco, then none of what any of us are probably talking about at your conference will happen. So kind of a real need for a new wave of investing in those capabilities. And it's hard to do that, again, if at best we think of the role of a civil servant as fixing, enabling, de-risking, you know, a lender of last resort, as opposed to what? Sharing risks, embracing uncertainty, co-creating value, not just facilitating value creation in the private sector. So a real new kind of theory of value that also needs to underpin a justification for making those investments. And forgive me, these are kind of really really broad areas, but I do think they're central. And it's, again, reflecting on the experience of the Institute in working on a lot of these kind of concrete things like procurement, like state banks, like increasing capacity and capabilities, which I think we need to do across the board. It's not kind of pick and choose. So first of all, the reason I've become kind of the mission lady, a missionary, is just, I think the lessons from the moon landing were hugely relevant, but we haven't actually learned them. And it's not about space. It's not about, top down, how do you say, mission orientation in that sense. But it really was so interesting how they would have never gotten to the moon had they not thought completely different about the public and the private sectors working together towards a goal. It's not surprising that actually, let me just go to this slide, that the first thing that NASA did to get to the moon was to change how they were doing procurement, away from cost plus contracts towards fixed price, challenge oriented contracts. They were, they knew their own self-worth in that process in terms of how they worked with the private sector. So they even took the time to design the contracts with fairness clauses. So no rents, no excess profits. Super interesting if you look at the causes of inflation today in terms of excess rents in different sectors and how we've allowed that. But again, there was 400,000 people that got us there. And what was so interesting was that this design of outcomes orientation, sure, there was one clear mission to the moon and back in a short amount of time. But the interesting thing was not that. The interesting thing was breaking it down into so many different projects and problems that had to be solved. And the way, again, they did that was through that outcomes-oriented procurement. They needed solutions for how the astronauts would eat, for how, the materials that they would have on them, so their clothing, how they would go to the bathroom, how they would move. And it was all those different solutions in the private sector, bottom up, not top down. What was top down was the clear statement of what the problems were, but the solutions were fostered in a very bottom up way. And it was the solutions to the problems that actually created growth. This is critical, by the way, because, for example, in the UK, where the Labour Party has taken on this idea of mission orientation, then their first mission was growth. It's like, no, if you get a mission-oriented approach, which fosters public and private sector investment with those contracts, which I'll get to in a minute, which catalyze a wave of innovation in a bottom-up way across many different sectors, then lo and behold, we get increases in productivity, increases in growth because of the solutions to these problems require that investment. And, this was across so many different sectors. It was not just aerospace, it was nutrition, materials, electronics, software. In many ways, the modern software industry can trace its origin back to the solutions that were required in the lunar module for data. And of course, you see where I'm getting at, very similar to so many of the different challenges we have today, whether it's climate change, whether it's health-related challenges, those represent the same thing as kind of the space race, but we need to transform them into missions that require cross-sectoral, cross-industrial innovation and investment. And so the idea of a mission-oriented approach is we begin with the challenges, but those are, the ones we've all signed up to, in case we forgot, the Sustainable Development Goals, turning them into moonshots and missions, which are clear and directed. You have a way to say yes or no, did we achieve it? But that fundamentally require cross-sectoral, otherwise we go down the picking winners route, cross-sectoral investment and collaboration. How do we design that through these tools? For example, and I'll get to others in a minute, public sector procurement, which are done in an outcomes-oriented way. So a really clear distinction between challenges, missions, sectors, and projects. And I had the honor in 2018, I think it was, to work closely with the head of innovation in the European Commission, asking what would this approach, this kind of outcomes orientation that puts industrial investment in both manufacturing and services within economies or regions at the center in a goal-oriented way, what would that mean for the Commission, which had been the European Commission, which had until then done a lot of blah, blah, blah about inclusive growth and sustainable growth, but it wasn't actually catalyzing a different way to think about that public-private investment partnership. So you can just see here some examples, like the climate one. One of the missions that they set for themselves was a ability. This, by the way, remember, is a regional policy, different from a national one, but it's parallel, if you want, in terms of the reasoning, and again, fostering that bottom-up innovation. I see my internet is unstable. Hopefully you can still hear me. Worked quite closely with the UK around this. In 2018, still that same year, they had a list of sectors, right? This is the picking winners problem. They were thinking that their key sectors were life sciences, finance, automobiles, aerospace, and the creative industry. BBC, great, company, but what does that actually mean? Why those 5 sectors? I helped the government rethink and say, what about making those verticals? Instead of choosing sectors, choose challenges. They chose these: clean growth, aging, future mobility. That data one's a bit weird because, of course, that goes across all challenges and missions, but this really helped them to rethink. This is just before Brexit, by the way. Brexit then got in the way, to rethink how they had been thinking about both government departments in terms of, say, the Department of Transport, right? Sustainable mobility is not just for the Department of Transport, but especially about the different sectors that they wanted to start really investing, especially in a country like the UK, where we have low private sector investment. We're 28th in the OECD, which doesn't mean we don't have profits, but those profits are not actually being reinvested back into the economy, let alone in a way that actually solves some of the key challenges. So you probably can't see this because it's tiny, but again, the challenge, future of mobility, the mission statement, it's not as sexy as getting to the moon and back, but it was on the back of the civil servants working with us in the Institute around experimenting how a mission statement might be designed to catalyze that investment. And they thought of this wordy one, which was by 2040 to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and admission-free zero accident systems. And what's important about this is that the fact that there's clear criteria, like universally accessible travel, means that some of those bottom-up projects that had to be fostered were in areas like disabilities, in order to make sure that, for example, the public infrastructure was pure, 100% accessible to those who were disabled. Institutions and tools, very important. Otherwise, this is all blah, blah, blah. So, very important to learn those lessons from changing the cost plus to the fixed price, challenge-oriented procurement with incentives for innovation, and so on, that NASA did. Brian Deese, who I've been speaking to, I don't know if he's there. Was he invited? Are you there, Brian? Anyway, thought a lot about this when he was the director of the National Economics Council. He gave some quite important speeches about this. But, this was then at the center of the federal Buy Clean initiative. But this really should be normalized. This isn't just about, the green economy. It's really interesting to see what's happening in Sweden, for example, where their high-level challenge is a fossil-free welfare state, but then they land it, normalize that idea in the everyday. So, for example, school lunch in Sweden has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable, and they use outcomes-oriented procurement to foster new solutions, investments, which diversify the food supply chain and its interaction with the school system. And what's interesting, of course, is that this becomes basically part of an innovation budget. In the UK, our whole innovation budget is 10 billion. It was actually just raised in the budget of this week or last week. What's today? I can't remember. Anyway, earlier this week, Rachel Reeves, our chancellor in the Labour Party, the new government, increased that. But recently, the numbers were 10 billion for the whole innovation budget. But then if you looked at the procurement budget for each department, it was huge, but it was being wasted. So by using outcomes-oriented procurement around really important goals that require innovation in the private sector, like that idea of school lunches being healthy, tasty, and sustainable, then all of a sudden that becomes part of your innovation budget if it catalyzes innovation. So the Ministry of Transport in the UK has about 40 billion in its procurement budget, right? Much more than the whole innovation budget. But if we're not thinking in that way of sustainable mobility with all those innovative criteria, then it's not part of the innovation budget. Here's just two examples of work we did in Camden Council, my neighborhood in London, also in Brazil, super interesting because Lula has hunger at the center of his policies. This idea, again, to use outcomes-oriented procurement to catalyze that investment and innovation across agribusiness, but also across, obviously, all sectors in order to fulfill goals. And don't worry, Martin, I have my timer here. I see I have 3.5 minutes left. I will stick to time, hopefully. But some really interesting work we did with public banks globally. You might know there's huge amounts of money in public banks. There's 22.2 trillion in national development banks, 2.2 trillion in multilateral development banks, but often this money is wasted. In Italy, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, sounds good because it's Italian, just gives out money with no conditions. Whereas what's interesting in Germany, because they had a clear mission, forget whether we like their mission or not, but they have it, the Energiewende, the way that the KfW interacted with the private sector had to change. So the way that the steel sector, for example, in Germany received a very critical loan, otherwise they were going under, was not just here's some money because you're in trouble, which is what happens with many public loans. It was here's some money if you really invest and innovate towards reducing the material content of production. And really that's the only reason we have green steel today in Germany, which, as you know, will have to be the future of steel because of how the world is going. And those that get in there first, of course, creates dynamic returns to scale. Let me just skip ahead a bit here. Here's a report that I did for the UN around this. Imagine if there was more, alignment and coherence between the big goals like the SDGs, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks actually helping to broker kind of relationships with the national development banks that then have that kind of conditionality at the center of how they work with the private sector to catalyze investment and innovation, as opposed to just sitting in place. And this, of course, comes to a key point about what does it mean to socialize both risks and rewards through these kinds of contracts. Danny Roderick, I think he's there. He and I wrote a paper about this. Again, how can we think in an outcomes-oriented way in terms of what it means for that kind of conditionality, in terms of profit sharing, in terms of conditions on reinvestment, in terms of directing towards goals. I already mentioned the example of the KfW. The CHIPS Act was super interesting at this level. People like Ezra Klein accused it for an everything bagel, but hey, a bagel with everything on it is actually quite delicious. And it's not about making a whole random shopping list of conditions. The ones that actually we engaged with Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, starting about 2.5 years ago, was on just kind of really obvious ones, right? Making sure that the profits generated from a big public program like CHIPS are reinvested back in, so limiting share buybacks, making sure that there's improved working conditions, and making sure that energy efficient supply chains are used. The people then critiqued some of the details that came out of that, but even just those three things in terms of energy efficiency, good working conditions, and limiting share buybacks, it's kind of shouldn't be rocket science. But also, a fairer reward system doesn't happen also without labor fighting for its own share. And as we know, the labor share of global income is at one of the lowest levels it's been historically in kind of global capitalism. And so really interesting what happened in the US with the recent auto strike almost a year ago now, where in order to prevent the green economy being erased to the bottom, of course, there was that very important negotiation that happened through the UAW, making sure that battery workers were getting paid as much and just as good working conditions. Don't have time to talk about this now, but of course, I've been talking about public-private, but of course, we also know that it's not just public-private. We need labor unions to be at the center of this. Let me just finish with this point. I already said it. Without capabilities, none of this happens. It's not surprising that the head of NASA, by the way, head of procurement in NASA, his name was Ernest Brackett. He already highlighted back in the 60s that he thought NASA was outsourcing too much its brain. And he had this wonderful quote I put in the book. He said, "We will get captured by brochuremanship. If we continue to do this, we won't know how to work with the private sector." It's not about not working with the private sector, but that requires capacity, capabilities to work across government ministries. Any mission like climate is not just for the Department of Energy. any mission around well-being, of course, is not just for the Department of Health. So capabilities for cross-ministerial thinking, the fact that all these ministries, of course, have procurement. We did a study during COVID, found that those countries that did better in the developing world were ones that had actually invested in such capabilities like e-governance and using digital platforms to fight also the infodemic side, instead of what? Instead of just bringing in a consultant to help you with the test and trace, and not then investing in the capacity of the civil service to use digital government to foster this outcomes orientation. So super interesting also to look at gov labs around the world, like in Chile, Laboratorio de Gobierno, creating these safe places actually for experimentation and embracing that underlying uncertainty. My recent book with my PhD student, The Big Con, kind of raised an alarm bell that, again, none of this happens if we McKinsey-fy our governments, but we don't blame McKinsey. We blame the governments that haven't actually done their job of investing inside. Oh, God. Okay, I promised to finish. Global governance. How do we make sure that this whole discussion about green industrial strategy is governed in such a way that puts equity at the center? The reason, again, that I've been traveling everywhere was to launch this recent report on thinking of the global hydrological cycle itself at the center of how we think of industrial strategy. 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled, which is crazy given that it's the state water rights that are given to Pepsi-Cola or the breweries. But if there's no conditionality that in exchange for accessing that water right, they need to recycle the industrial wastewater, then we obviously don't get it. But this requires a global governance because, as we know, deforestation in one part of the world is linked to floods and droughts in other parts. So what does it mean to do that? A G20 report that we also just used to launch this idea of green industrial strategy and green financial policy with global governance of equity at the center. This also just came out last week. Again, the reason I'm on all these planes, but this doesn't happen on its own. Green IRA, great for the US, but unless we have conditions of knowledge sharing and technology transfer, then not so great for other parts of the world. Similarly with the EU CBAM treaty. So let me just finish there. Oh, God, don't believe the hype. All these myths around industrial strategy. It's not picking winners, it's picking the willing. I've really already gone down these. I'm going to share my slides with you all later. But what we do in the Institute is we really argue that none of this happens without a change in narrative. This is my last slide. From fixing to co-creating, from de-risking to welcoming uncertainty, from picking winners to picking the willing, from leveling the playing field, which would kind of be fine if things were okay, towards tilting towards a direction where then we use all those different levers to really catalyze that economy-wide investment and collaboration towards these goals. We must stop the outsourcing, invest in that capacity, and we need better metrics. We need metrics that aren't just about cost benefit, but that really capture all those different spillovers across the way. Again, even if they had blown up just before getting to the moon, one could argue that it would have still been successful given the investment and innovation that was catalyzed across all those different sectors. Thank you.
This doesn't seem to be working. Okay, now it works. Okay, great. So we will begin the discussion. You will need to use a mic. Mariana, if you can't hear the question, let me know, and I repeat. So, gentlemen there, both of you, so you first. Can you also introduce yourself so Mariana knows who she's talking
Sure.
to?
Hi, my name is Yan Xu. I'm a postdoc at Brown University. So I think it's interesting that you talk about the mission to the moon, which is in the context of the Cold War, and there's an eerie resemblance to what the condition we're in right now, which is geopolitical competition between U.S. and China. So, and you talk about global governance, which is encouraging. I guess if you see any tension between, on the one hand, increasingly the missions are defined by national states, for geopolitical purposes, but on the other hand, given climate change and other challenges, there seems to be, the need for more collaboration and cooperation. I wonder how you see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, should I answer one by one, or are you going to collect? I'm happy to do one by one.
Do one by one. We have time for that.
Okay, good. Because that then doesn't require me to take notes also because I don't know where any pens or papers are in this. Okay, so really good question. Thanks for asking it. I think there's two parts of that question. One is that, yes, the moon landing was in the context of the Cold War, and that's exactly the point, that we take war seriously, right? Unfortunately, we're back in a geopolitical, wartime era. But what's interesting is that when we treat things as urgent, we then actually, at the national level, and I'll get to the global cooperation in a second, then have a history of knowing how to foster good public-private relationships. Even when health is spent by the military, because soldiers get sick on the battlefield, they've always used the kind of advanced purchasing agreements that we did during COVID, but then forgot to do both pre and post-COVID. The right kind of property rights in order to make sure that we socialize both risks and rewards has always been used by, again, DARPA. So that kind of outcomes orientation, the reason we have all these technologies on our iPhones that are smart and not stupid came out of purpose-oriented military industrial complex institutions that solved problems like internet, getting the satellites to communicate, GPS. The Navy wanted to know where the ships were. So one of the questions I ask in my work is, hold on a second, if we know how to do it for the military industrial complex, why don't we do it for these massive social and wicked challenges that we have, like climate change, like biodiversity, like water issues, like health? It's because we simply, I don't want to say don't care, but we haven't actually created really clear missions around them. We just put in money here, money there, not enough money, but even when there is money, it's not done in an outcomes-oriented way, let alone when we don't actually spend money on it. We don't do those symbiotic public-private partnerships. We have very parasitic partnerships in the health industry, for example, where the NIH spends in the US $40 billion a year, and then the prices don't reflect it, the intellectual property right structure doesn't reflect it. So that's the first point, that if we've signed up to the SDGs, not because I think they're important, but because every country has signed up to them, then what would it mean to turn them into kind of serious and urgent priorities? And again, that's one big question. And to admit that it's not that we don't know how, it's that we've decided not to treat them urgently. Because when we do decide to treat things urgently, money comes out of thin air. Like, just look at what happened with Ukraine. Germany said there was no money for its green economy. Big fight between the Minister of Finance and Minister of Economy. And then all of a sudden, for the war, 190 billion comes out of the woodwork. So, which I'm not saying was the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying, where was that money before, when they were saying there is no money? So then the global cooperation, unfortunately, it's absolutely not happening. And in fact, in this G20 report that we just did on governing green industrial strategy with equity and justice at the center, we make that point, not to say that the IRA was necessarily bad, say, for Africa, but unless we actually govern that relationship, it will be bad for especially developing countries which have seen some green capital move to the US in order to benefit from those subsidies. So governing a green industrial strategy globally, first of all, it's important because the climate battle, the climate change, global heating problem that in theory the IRA is also addressing. Obviously, that wasn't positioned that way in the US because the political economic situation is different, but that was very important that it had that green dimension. That requires, that kind of cross-sectoral investment. But also, what was I saying? Sorry, it was good for the US, but unless it's done in a way that, again, has technologies transfer agreements and knowledge sharing agreements, then it doesn't work in terms of the global climate problem, right? Because it's just like with the health pandemic, it didn't work to have vaccine nationalism, given that it was a global health crisis. And what we say in the water report, and I think the reason it's very important, this new water report, which is the trilogy of the Nick Stern climate, the Gupta biodiversity, and then we did water, myself and 3 co-chairs, including the president of Singapore and the head of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, was to say, look at the science. The science tells us that the problem cannot be solved nationally. Again, deforestation here causes floods and droughts there. So we're globally interconnected. The hydrological cycle goes across not only all countries, but across all the SDGs and all sectors. And yet we are governing the water problem not in a global way. So I think we have to also begin with the science, because otherwise it's just about, if it's just about equity, then countries could say, who cares? And that's wrong. but but if you also show that they will not be able to solve their own water problems unless they think in a global way, because it's going to come back to bite, just like in the case of the vaccine, when we allowed a whole part of the world to be unvaccinated, the virus came back to bite, then that's what we kind of argue is absolutely required. And it doesn't happen on its own without new governance systems. And we argue that we need to really admit that the whole WTO system, which has prevented an industrial strategy from even taking off in certain countries because of backwards rules, that needs to change. But also what needs to change is to actually state these missions in such a way that require that global governance.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Gustavo. I work at the Chicago Fed. So when we think about industrial policy, usually we think about Korea, Japan, Taiwan, which are the successful cases. There are industrial policies as well in other countries. So for instance, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela have been implementing industrial policies for years and years. And I don't think that we can say that Venezuela is a successful case. So my question is, what is the key to make an industrial policy successful? What is that the Latin America has been doing wrong that the Asian countries are doing right?
Great question. Actually wrote the Entrepreneurial State to debunk this idea. That industrial strategy is useless, but also that it only takes one form. So we wouldn't have had Silicon Valley without a decentralized network of purpose-oriented state institutions across the whole innovation chain in the US. It wasn't just basic research that was commercialized by private venture capital. It was actually this decentralized presence of basic research, applied research, fostering science industry linkages, outcomes-oriented demand-side procurement that created markets. So the startups that were funded could actually even have a market, and even more downstream, other kind of demand-side tools. So first of all, those countries that think that industrial strategy just requires any one of those areas. And I forgot to mention patient long-term capital was critical in the US, just not through a public bank. The Public Bank of Brazil, absolutely critical to its industrial strategy. BNDES in the US has found its form, at least historically, more through organizations like In-Q-Tel, the CIA's largest, one of the largest public venture capital funds in the world, in the CAA, but also through the SBIR program, for example, which requires 3 to 5% of every government department to fund innovative solutions in small and medium enterprises. That has allowed startups to scale, right? So that scaling up process. So the first point is that industrial strategy doesn't work if you just pick and choose. Oh, we'll just do a lot of basic research. Oh, we'll just bring in some, development bank to provide the patient finance. So it requires that distributed network of different institutions across the whole innovation chain working well with the private sector. Now, what does it mean to work well with the private sector? It doesn't mean just giving out guarantees and subsidies, A. It doesn't mean choosing sectors, which has happened in many countries where they just make a list of 1 or 2 or 3 sectors. In Latin America, often natural resource sectors. The whole picking winners problem refers to that. And it's been used to say we don't need industrial strategy, but that's a very specific form of industrial strategy where you're putting all your eggs in the basket. You're not going up the value chain in those particular sectors because you're just seeing the sector itself as opposed to a transformational growth agenda that's required for that sector to innovate and to invest in order to be part of a solution. So in Chile today, for example, there's some conditions that the Boric government is putting on the copper sector that were not there before, or lithium extraction, as you know, might help us solve the battery problem in many countries that want electrification. But if the extraction of that lithium is being done in problematic ways that is hurting water and is unsustainable, then you're kind of solving one problem here and creating another problem there. So by putting conditionality, coming back to that conditionality to make sure that the way that lithium is extracted is itself innovative, requires change, investment, so recycling, repurpose, reuse, and so on, like that example of green steel in Germany, already that requires investment in countries that have low investment. So my friend Luciano Coutinho, who used to run BNDES in Brazil, the big public bank, used to say, Brazil is capitalism without capitalists, right? So how do you use these tools, industrial strategy tools, to get the business sector to actually do its job, to invest its money, and not just to extract it out, whether it's dividend payouts and so on, to reinvest in, but towards goals. Why are those goals important? Not only because they are goals that can help us achieve, for example, not only, but an example, a sustainable economy, but also because unless there's a goal there, it turns out that that sector is just getting money for standing still. Super interesting example is Fiat in Italy is historically has not invested. It's actually a very problematic company which benefits from state subsidies called Cassa Integrazione. So when times are bad, the state picks up the wage bill. When times are good, surprise, surprise, all the money goes to Fiat. When they went to the US to buy Chrysler, which was in state hands, because you'll remember not just the banks, but the automobile companies were bailed out, Sergio Merchione, the head of Fiat, was asked by Obama, if you want to buy Chrysler, which is currently in public hands, you have to invest in hybrid technology, which Fiat did in the US, but didn't do in Italy, right? So it's not just about industrial strategy. It comes back down to these contracts, these partnerships, relationships, relational value that I don't think modern industrial strategy has thought enough about. And the reason why many industrial strategies haven't worked in the countries you've mentioned is when, and you know, Latin America is very different. Brazil actually has had a successful industrial strategy. Venezuela, definitely not. Mexico, not. Argentina, not. So we need to be less ideological and actually look at exactly what happened in those countries, often just due to the lack of proper investment, but especially when that investment was just maybe helicopter money going down to particular sectors versus distributed through capable, outcomes-oriented institutions working well with the private sector with well-designed contracts. And if you look at BNDES, it has both a good history of that, but also a bad history. So even the same institution, we can learn a lot about when it worked and when it didn't. So I really believe in not just looking at big blocks of countries like the BRICS, very different one from another, or Latin American countries, but look at organizational experiences or at the level of a tool. I mentioned the Swedish school meal policy, the public bank in Germany, its relationship with steel. There's, you know, the CHIPS Act, what worked, what didn't, in terms of fostering a different relationship from what we saw in Silicon Valley, where the good part of the story was the part I said. The bad part of that story was, you know, we fostered a massive value creation, but basically socialized risks and privatized rewards. And they could have done that bit better. And I've written about that in the Entrepreneurial State, the kind of Solyndra Tesla difference, which I'll shut up now because I'm sure there's another question. But we really need to learn what it means to set up, you know, public investment in such a way that it's an investor of first resort, not a lender of last resort, through a portfolio approach, socializing both risks and rewards, instead of just saying we need public banks.
Thank you. Next, Juan Carlos here in the middle, third row.
Hi, I'm Juan Carlos Halak from the University of Buenos Aires. I would like to ask you to say something more about the organization of the state to conduct the policy the way you propose. I understand that the idea is that all areas of government are embedded in this idea, in this way of doing things, of interacting with the public, or with the private sector. But at the same time, you need some projects, you need coordination, you need lines of report. So the question is, are there guidelines of how to do this, how to organize the state, or should each country find its own way? And last request, if you could have, in your answer, a focus on developing countries. Thank you.
Sure. So thanks for the question. And I think we circulated some material, but I'll ask Francesca, who's there in my team, to circulate it on the experience and the learnings we've had in specific developing countries, including Brazil. on what made a difference. So, for example, in Brazil, I think what's currently happening that's very interesting is that the ecological transition strategy, which is an industrial strategy, sits in the finance ministry. There's also, very importantly, green, if you want, goals, but also structures and funds, obviously in other ministries, like in the science ministry, the Ministry of the Environment, run by Minister Marina Silva. But a big change, I think, or what's often lacking in terms of the bureaucratic setup of industrial strategy is that it just gets siloed in such a way that doesn't then affect the structure of the economic tools and the financial tools. And of course, some countries have both an economics ministry and a finance ministry. Sometimes they're together. But what's happened in Brazil recently is the fact that its ecological transition was in the finance ministry, is that very important questions had to be answered in terms of what it meant for the structure of finance. So not just the financial gap that comes from a market fixing view, but the structure of finance itself. So that long-term, patient, outcomes-oriented finance, what would it mean for the way that BNDES and other public funds create loans if the ecological transition is at the center? And that's what, in terms of the military-industrial complex before, the whole idea of when people say a war room kind of mentality, it's precisely whether it was COVID, when millions of people were dying, there was the COVID war room that brought different ministries together, or literally during war, you have different ministries together in the war room with the president. But, hopefully, ideally, we wouldn't have wars to remind us why we need that. And by taking something like the ecological transition seriously, it, first of all, requires that, again, war room kind of cross-ministerial kind of thinking. That's the first thing. Second is that attention to the tools, herramientas. I was just in Colombia, where the current president talks a lot about these different goals that they have, but it hasn't translated into rethinking the tools, the institutions. So what's happening in Colombia, actually led by Jose Antonio Campos' own ex-ministerial governance there. He was the Minister of Finance. He already had set up, alongside someone else called Jorge Ivan, who also left. He was running the DNP, the National Planning Office for Colombia, which sat above all the different ministries, a process that's very important that's happening there, which I think is critical for a mission-oriented industrial strategy, is to have more coherence and alignment between all the different tools. Otherwise, as Keith Pavitt used to say, he was a very important economist at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit, he said, otherwise it's just kind of pissing in the wind. Forgive my French, right? So if you just have a bit of funding here, a bit of funding there, and all these little public banks, but not coordinated, that's a problem. Again, in a military-industrial complex, we tend to find much more coordination between the different tools. Whereas when we don't take problems seriously, we don't have it. So in Colombia right now, they have a process which hasn't been happening as fast as it should, but it's called the Grupo Bicentenario, which is not so much a holding company like Temasek, but a coordination device to make sure that their own public banks, which are kind of smallish, they're not like BNDES, but just have more coordination if the ecological transition, again, is going to actually happen. Because otherwise, that kind of lack of coordination means that the sum is not greater than the parts. Third, this whole issue of purpose orientation, right? If we have problems, and I see this even at the very local level, so we have a knife crime epidemic in London, what does it mean to actually put zero knife crime as the goal? And this is between teenagers, so there's different forms of knife crime, but you focus on teenagers, youth, that sense of disengagement. When their own life has no value, it's much easier to kill someone else. Social and economic determinants of crime. What does it mean not to say, oh, there's a bit of money here for social services, a bit of money here for mental health, lots of money there for police and jailing and so on, but then, just hoping that somehow you stir the soup and you solve the problem. So outcomes-oriented budgeting, where you actually say, here's a problem. We're going to get all those different groups, like the ones I just mentioned, for mental health, after-school clubs, youth centers, policing done with empathy. That's obviously for a social goal. It's a bit less about an industrial strategy, but there's no way we can solve our social goals without thinking in that outcomes-oriented way. And there's lots of interesting lessons on that. Again, in Brazil, if we look at Porto Alegre, their participatory budgeting experience was also very interesting. And lastly, it connects to the previous question. What we know doesn't work in developing countries is when this just becomes an opportunity for lots of capture from particular sectors, including, by the way, the sectors that we all like to love, like renewable energy. There's lots of regressive tax policies being done today in the name of having a more renewable energy system. In fact, Joe and I were both in Bellagio with a particular researcher who was looking at that, the kind of regressive lobbying that's happening in renewable energy, but definitely in sectors like agribusiness or different types of natural resources, if they're seen as sectors and not inputs towards problems that need to be solved, it's not surprising that we get failures in industrial strategy.
Question.
Hi, I'm Ishana Ratan, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, and I have a question on capacity building in low and middle income countries. So I'm curious how you see technology transfer unfolding. Foreign companies are often reluctant to do technology transfer in traditional sectors like semiconductor manufacturing, for example. So how do we facilitate that in even more cutting edge technology like green steel making, where firms have an even greater incentive to safeguard research and development? I'm curious specifically where you see the levers of change. Is it host home country governments in countries with lead firms, the firms themselves, or are there opportunities for international institutions to get involved?
Great question. And the G20 report, which again just came out last week, that Bear-Song and I co-chaired, kind of addresses that. And I think first we need to look at the national and then ask what it means for also the global governance. So again, look at during COVID, there was 8 vaccines. The vaccine was not the goal. It was global vaccination, but only one of the vaccines, the AstraZeneca one, actually had a partnership around knowledge sharing. And that was not because it was a good company. It was because the publicly funded researchers at Oxford is a state school, put it as a condition to keep the prices low, the costs low, and to engage in a real knowledge sharing kind of patent pool agreement. And if AstraZeneca had said, we're not interested, Oxford would have been like, yeah, whatever, we're not going to work with you. So that idea of, again, making sure that we take seriously these concepts of collective intelligence and collaboration towards goals, we should learn, again, where it worked, where it didn't. That paper that Danny and I wrote looked at national policies. So what's interesting is that case with the AstraZeneca case was precisely because the Oxford University researchers were interested in the global dimension. They wanted to make sure that African countries could produce the vaccine and didn't have to rely on the so-called global north to send over expired. That's what happened. They not only hoarded the vaccines, they sent over expired vaccines, which is a crime. Making sure we create that productive capacity in the global south requires a very different type of agreement of how we produce, right? That pre-distributive structure of production and not just redistributive, right? This is an important difference, right? Market shaping versus market fixing can also translate into pre-distribution versus redistribution. How do we get those capital labor relationships right, public-private relationships right, and global relationships right? And that's where, I'm in Barbados, where during COVID, obviously, this little island could not do things on its own. You needed a regional strategy, a Caribbean-wide, a Latin American strategy. We didn't see that. So we shouldn't just blame, the kind of the Bretton Woods system in terms of what the Bridgetown Initiative is currently arguing has to happen, which I support. I helped to I contributed to that. We should also make sure that countries like in Latin America actually revive what there used to be much more of, and we see very little of it, which is regional, not just policies, but again, this advanced purchasing agreements, but also relationships between these different public funds. If you look at how CAF and IDB work, their relationship with national banks and helping to foster those public banks because they're required for a functional industrial strategy in places like Mexico has not happened, in places like Brazil has happened. So And then just sorry, in terms of the actual question around, the big new technologies, whether it's AI, whether it's thinking of good steel versus bad steel, definitely the national policies is that those countries which have had good steel, like the green steel, was from a different national public-private relationship, similarly to the CHIPS Act, which was national, a better public-private relationship where semiconductors had to become better companies in terms of working conditions, limiting share buybacks, and energy efficient supply chains. But your question, I think the much more difficult answer to that is, what does that mean then for the global, for those global partnerships, which again, I mentioned the G20 report talks about. But my own experience is that ironically, we have better discussions at the global level because we have the UN, because we have, the IMF and the World Bank under their current leadership, the discussion about rethinking international finance, that's sort of happening. But at the national level, as long as you have an incapable state or a state that hasn't invested even in its legal negotiation power, let alone, that rethink of what the civil service is for, to not just fix, but to shape, to invest in the training, to set up GovLabs and so on. That's where I see really, really problematic relationships of just systems that are subsidies, grants, and loans. The UK is like that, right? During COVID, we gave 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. It's one of our airlines. In France, the loans that were given to both Air France and Renault were conditional that they commit to lowering carbon emissions over the next 5 years. So I think what we need to do is really look at both local, regional, national policies that represent, that reveal interesting properties that we can learn from in terms of a better public-private relationship that's, again, symbiotic and not parasitic, market shaping, not just market fixing. And then, of course, ask, what does that mean for the global governance structure? But without global institutions like a reformed WTO, it's not going to happen. I was just in Mexico, and there's real problems in terms of the knowledge sharing agreements that should be there if Mexico is going to have a functional relationship with the United States.
Thank you, Mariana. And we have time for one last short question with a short answer. So that's Matthias.
Matthias Thielmann, Sciences Po. I'll be very quick. At OECD recently, there was a global industrial policy, green industrial policy event, and one member country after the other came in and said, this is what we do, and this is how we will become the leader in this industry. And it was really funny because it was all on Zoom, and these guys never heard the next guy. And they all said the same thing. And then you were like, but this is not really an integrated, coordinated approach. And I would be really interested in hearing more about integrated and or coordinated approaches to these industrial policies that seem all to aim for the global leadership, or at least in their discursive aspirations want to go there, which seems impossible. Thank you.
Absolutely. I don't even think we learn. I mean, even within Europe, we haven't learned, right? If you think about the whole narrative after the financial crisis was that the Southern European countries had to become more competitive, like the Germans and the Scandinavians, and there was all this conditionality limiting the deficit spending in countries like, well, the so-called pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, not learning at all what actually made Germany more competitive. In Italy, where I'm from, we don't have the Fraunhofer Institutes, which create science industry linkages. We don't have a dynamic, outcomes-oriented public bank like KfW. Ours, again, just gives out loans to ailing industries, which, ask for help. We don't have proper apprenticeship and training programs. Anyway, so on and so forth. So even within a limited region, like the European region, we have not actually shared, or the other way, of course, would have been great things that happen in Italy besides the good food. We actually have some very interesting education at the nursery school level in Emilia-Romagna that hasn't, so we don't have a learning region in terms of learning what works, what doesn't. And in terms of industrial strategy, we continue to kind of go back and forth between either thinking, it's dangerous, it's going to get captured, picking winners, it's going to crowd out, Or, we just say, okay, we need a greener economy and industrial strategies required for that. And you have every country reinventing what's required, not having proper communication. So one of the things we did in the Institute is we set up this network of 100 global public organizations that were sharing their own experience of thinking in this outcome-oriented industrial strategy way. It's called the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network. And it was super interesting because it required conversations between public banks, whether it's the KfW or BNDES or a new public bank we actually helped to structure in Scotland, and organizations like the BBC, which is a really interesting, well-designed public institution, which has always held itself accountable with dynamic metrics around this concept of public value. What is public value? You can read our report with the BBC, but it was so interesting to see conversations between a public bank, the BBC, a digital agency like the one of Ada Colau, who was the mayor of Barcelona, of talking about this shared practice of what does market shaping look like if it's not just market fixing? What did it require for the new contracts between that public and private actor? What's a good example? What's a bad example? What was the new culture that was required in the institution in terms of welcoming uncertainty and actually investing in the learning capacity of the civil servants to work well with others? This is never just about the state. And so I don't know which conference you're talking about, but I know there was one last week where I did a virtual keynote on mission-oriented policies. The whole conference was around that. But I also think there's the other problem that now it's sort of like a bandwagon effect, and that concept is out there, but it's being completely deformed. And so I think we need to be careful when it's old wine in new bottles. We've already had the cluster, people talking about clusters or smart cities and missions and so on. These should be used to upset the status quo and to be a thorn in the side of a system, which frankly is also one that has allowed us to have the kind of problems we have today, which are not just about global warming, but also this extreme financialization of our economy. 7 trillion, that's a lot of money, has been used just for buying back shares, in the global companies in the last 10 years. That lack of reinvestment back into the economy, let alone directed investment to solve our big goals. That's what I think, for me at least, new industrial strategy should be doing. But if you look around the world, that kind of real requirement for also metrics, as I said before, that can differentiate a symbiotic versus a parasitic or predator-prey ecosystem, which a biologist would hold the system accountable to because they actually have metrics for that. I hope that this idea of a new industrial strategy really helps to focus on that also, because I briefly mentioned, but maybe I can just close with this, labor is critical. Inequality that we see in many parts of the world is not due to some deterministic feature. It's due to the result of corporate governance structures we have. Of course, the weakening of unions in many countries. In Colombia, they literally killed the trade unionists. So not surprising that that was also linked to higher inequality. But it's not just about these institutions. It really is about the negotiation and making sure that if what we're trying to do is create also more directed growth towards solving big problems like the greener economy, where do those profits go? How can we make sure that the rewards are truly shared? And that's where I think we really need much more evidence of good practice, because if we don't solve that, we end up with civil war.
Thank you, Mariana, and everyone for the excellent discussion. We will have a 10 minutes break and we'll come back for the next paper session. And we say goodbye to you, Mariana, with a final applause.
Thank you.